It has been nearly a year since the tragic Usindiso building fire, and some of the survivors who were displaced now find themselves living in an informal settlement situated behind the five-story building. This Saturday marks the anniversary of the extensive blaze that devastated the hijacked property in Johannesburg's inner city, leading to the deaths of 76 individuals and leaving many others without homes. Let's now reflect on this further with human rights activist Andy Chinnah. Andy, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Now, Andy, we often speak of the 76 victims that lost their lives in this fire. We speak of over 500 people that were displaced, but it's not every day that we actually know the real stories of the experiences from that night and now a year on. Just talk to us about some of the engagements that you've had with individuals who've lost loved ones and are now finding themselves having to navigate not having a home and also having lost the ones that they love.
I've just come from the middle of the CBD, speaking to a mum. Tembi has lost her daughter in the fire. Tembi's daughter went to visit her boyfriend who lives on the 4th floor of the building, and she passed away in the fire. You know, when they're trying to move on, that hurts, they still carry that hurt. Even Jabu, who's the boyfriend, was telling me this evening, he said he doesn't know how to continue on with life because he came to Joburg from Mpumalanga looking for a better life. And what he's returning to now is this loss of his. So I can tell you another story of Busisiwe, who on the night of the fire dropped her 2-year-old son out of the building, the 4th floor. He was caught at the bottom. She then decided to jump. And before she jumped, she said to her 16-year-old daughter, you know, she looked back and she said, "Melita, jump." 2 days later, she gets up in ICU and finds out that Melita has died in the fire. You know, how do you get back when you lose everything, including a loved one? Because you can lose all your possessions, but when you have your family, you have something, you know, and these are the stories that are still being told, that we have lost everything, but to lose family members on top of it is a real tragedy.
I mean, it's such a tragedy hearing the story each and every time, even a year on. I mean, we know that the inquiry took place and some of the findings that were found in that inquiry. But what help are people getting from an emotional and mental well-being point of view? Because when you tell these stories and some of the things that they went through, we know that children are not in school because obviously being displaced and documents not being available, but just their mental well-being and their wellness, has that been taken care of?
Sadly, you know, when we refer to something as a year, the period seems so short. But when you actually look at something as an intervention and you look at the hours, it's almost about 8,700 hours. When I look at 8,700 hours and I look at what disaster management has done, the local government, the provincial, the national government, it's not enough. After almost 8,000 hours, people are still feeling that pain, you can imagine that they have no trauma counseling. We run a trauma counseling once a Saturday based on donors who have come to the fore, and we give counseling to some women. I can tell you that every single session is like a new start. You can see them healing, but that's a very small group of people. There are people that are still living under bridges because there hadn't been, some of the victims have been moved to Denver, the settlement.
Yes.
And others didn't get into Denver because other buildings moved in there. So there were other fires in the city, and the city decided to dump people there. So some people are still living under things. In terms of mental wellness, nothing, absolutely nothing. And the proof is, go and speak to any of those victims, and you'll see on a one-on-one basis, they may have smiles, but when they get into a personal chat with you, they break down. I've had 4 people today break down. 4 people break down, a mom telling me about her daughter that died, Jabu losing his girlfriend, another mom that had to bury her daughter in KwaZulu-Natal. She wasn't given any funds. She had to pawn her car. And she's now got a younger daughter who she treats like gold. And we got her into school. The school didn't allow her in during winter because she didn't have a jersey and a blazer. So you can see these traumas, you know, these traumas. You have a mom who has a 2-year-old child, and she's got to rebuild her life. And then she says, I can't get a job because I have to look after my 2-year-old. You know, So where's the social support here? You know, when we're looking at over 8,000 hours, we need to ask ourselves, have we done enough? And if you look at the victims, they will tell you in many words that you have not done enough. We are still suffering. We are still feeling the trauma.
And I can imagine the trauma of some of the families who's the 17 bodies that are still lying in the mortuary that haven't been buried a year later.
It's a long time. You know, everything that I look at, I take it personally. I take injustice personally. So it's like me losing somebody and thinking that I cannot find them for a whole year or I cannot bury them for a year. When I speak to individuals that have lost people in the fire, you can feel that, you know, it's not just somebody else, it's somebody special to me. Obviously, the state has tried. I mean, the investigating officer has tried. There have been a few hiccups in DNA processing, which has taken a long time. Then you get family members that have come forward and the DNA hasn't matched. Those are exceptional cases, and that's very small, a very small percentage. But there are some individuals that are lying in the morgue who have just not been identified. I know I spoke to the investigating officer last week, and he said that finally Interpol is actually going to intervene and help us to identify some of those relatives. So we're hoping that will bring some closure to some people.
Yes, that closure certainly is needed. Let's now, Andy, just get into the intervention that has been done by government. And you're saying more can be done. Do you think they've done relatively enough with what they have in terms of resources, in placing people where they needed to be placed, in assisting in whichever way that the survivors of that building needed to be assisted with?
There's a very important four-letter word called will. There is no will to get things done. With the amount of resources that the government has in terms of personnel, money, experience, they haven't stepped up to it. They haven't treated this as a disaster. We've been saying this is a disaster. It's not just a building fire. 76 people lost their lives. It's the largest amount of lives that have been lost in a fire in Africa. We're not talking about a small number here. You know, when we look at the intervention from housing, people have been dumped in Denver. On the first day that I arrived in Denver, these little tinfoil structures that had been built, I looked at the clouds and I said, there's no drainage here. This place is going to flood. Guess what? We had a major cloudburst and the place flooded. People then had mattresses all destroyed. Their food was destroyed. Their clothes were wet. Did government step up and do anything and even rectify that situation? No. If you return to Denver right now, you will see it's the same. They don't have electricity for almost a year. You know, people are still living under bridges. There's only 17 units occupied in Denver. We had more than 342 people come to the commission to give their stories and their version of the stories. Many of those people are either in the middle of the city, as you say, Amakoseni, which is an informal settlement just behind where the tragedy took place. This is how desperate people are. They're even prepared to go back and face waking up every morning a building that took lives of their loved ones, their friends, their possessions. You know, many of them were informal traders. They kept the cash under the mattress. You know, they kept their stock in their room. Everything destroyed. You know, walking around the city without an ID book. People don't understand that. You are nobody. You get stopped by somebody in the street wearing a green uniform who wants to know whether you're a foreign national and yet you're South African, but you can't produce your ID, but you look darker or you don't feel in place. Only because of a document. You are now considered illegal because the state cannot issue you with a document.
Right. Just on the issue of housing, what's your take on temporary housing versus permanent housing? Because some argue that the residents within the building were paying for rent, they were paying whether it was to the people that hijacked the building. So could government then just find structures in which they could house them with dignity that they could pay for?
I have not met one victim who says to me, I will not pay. Every single victim, as you rightly point out, was paying money, between 800 and 1,800 rand for a little piece of a room there. Right now, people are staying in Denver. What we're hearing is that somebody from a camp nearby is saying they're going to have to pay 300 rand without water, without electricity. People are paying elsewhere in buildings in the city. I know of a mom who's paying 1,700 rand. That is a disastrous room that she's staying in, but she's got to take that thing. You know, when we approached the housing department, they say we have a shortage of 500,000 units in Joburg itself. What are we supposed to do? We had 30 years to figure this out, and we haven't figured it out. You know, people are prepared to even build their own structures, but given land, there's no land being given. You know, there's no support to say, let's get you back on your feet. What can we do? It's a case of, oh, the fire has occurred, and people, I was told this. Andy, you are over-exaggerating because people are used to living in these conditions. So I have to say, well, why are people living in these conditions? And I asked them, would you like to live in Sandton, or would you like to live in Denver? Not one of them have ever said to me, no, we're happy to stay in Denver. We don't want to go and stay in the mansions in Sandton. Everybody has aspirations. You know, so these officials that think, oh, it's okay because people lived in a building like that, don't understand that people strive for more. And dignity is what we're fighting for. You know, the Constitution is quite clear in terms of housing. It's quite clear in terms of education. It's quite clear in terms of health. When I look at Denver itself, an elderly lady the other day had a flu, and I said, aren't you going to go to the clinic? And she said to me, I have to cross the railway line in Jeppe. My back is sore. I have to walk 5 kilometers to the clinic. Whereas if they were in the city, you know, you get taxis in the city, you can go to Charlotte Makeka Hospital, you can go to the clinics. It's out in the Bundus thing. You know, it costs people 16 rand a day to get into the city and back. That's 800 rand a month. People that lived in Usindiso would use the 800 rand to actually buy something to sell. That was home for them. As much as people say that house, that building was, you know, devastating and things like that, whenever I've spoken to the victims, they always had good memories of the place. They always talked about it as home. They learned to navigate around the crime in the area. They learned to navigate around the bad situation and still called it home.
You mentioned 30 years that government had in order to fix the housing situation. And yesterday, the president was answering questions in Parliament, and he admitted that over the 30 years, they were unable to dismantle the apartheid structures of how spatial planning in the country currently is. Do you think we're edging anywhere close to our NDP 2030 visions and goals when it comes to housing?
I'm going to refer back to that four-letter word of will. You knew this 30 years ago. You had no will to fix it. Now you come up with a policy document that starts to tell us what? That you have gone and observed housing in Singapore or in Colombia, and you want to have a cut and paste model down here. We are a different culture. We have different landscapes here. We have different people with different economic situations. When we're looking at housing, we need to address the housing problem as we need it in South Africa. I don't believe policy documents are going to fix anything. Let's look at Usindiso and say, what have we done for the people of Usindiso in the last 8,000 days? Have we produced one house in 8,000 days? Not one house. So how can the president tell me that he's now got a piece of paper, okay, however long that may be, that it's going to fix the problem? It won't fix it.
Now, the commission took place, Andy, and Chief Justice, or rather Justice Khampepe has come out to say that the city needs to be held liable for the situation. In terms of your engagements with the city, how far are they in holding officials liable for the fire at Usindiso?
A few weeks ago, I attended a inner city forum meeting, which was hosted by the mayor. And I asked the officials, so when are we going to get response to the report? And his words were, you know, we're busy with national elections, and we've got upheavals in the mayoral chamber, and we are sorting out political issues. And I thought to myself, well, what's national elections got to do with the local government, especially a metro? You know, I think Panyaza Sufi, when we did the handover of the report from the commission to him, to the city of Joburg, I posed the same question. I said, when are we going to get a response to the report? And he said, Andy, let's give the city some time to digest the report. Fair enough. But how long? Nobody knows. And this is a common thing, with a common thread with dealing with this disaster. There is no plan. There's no end date. Nobody can tell us the steps that they are now doing. We are reviewing this document. You know, we are going to pass it to our legal team on this particular day. You will get a response on this particular day. So victims themselves are saying, Andy, are we fighting hard enough here? Because we are not getting the answers. You know, we're not looking at some minor judge or legal student. We're looking at a very esteemed former constitutional court justice, Sisi Kempepe. She's looked at the evidence. She said in her report, these are the individuals that need to be taken to task. How difficult is it if I read a document and I look at a person's name and I start my investigation? How long should it take? And why did the city have to wait for almost 8,000 days, 8,700 days, for a justice to tell them what is going wrong in the city? Have they got no control of the city? That they don't know what some of the employees are doing on a daily basis? You know, this is a man-made disaster. It could have been prevented. And it could have been prevented if people did their jobs. So we are hoping for the next step is that the city will take action. And if the city does not take action, the activists on the ground will not stop. We will not stop. We will hold them accountable. We cannot have another disaster like this. This is a small disaster compared to what can happen if we look at the amount of dilapidated buildings in the city.
Speaking of those dilapidated buildings within the city, what role does the community have when it comes to hijacked buildings? Because we know that the city certainly has a responsibility, especially with Usindiso, which is a building that belonged to the city. But we know that the Jeppies Town building belonged to a private player who left the building. It was hijacked. What role can society play in a preventative role in ensuring that such buildings don't get to such a state, and then the opportunists of people coming in to hijack those buildings does not exist?
I think we kind of clarified the word hijacked. None of the buildings are hijacked.
Okay.
Those buildings are either abandoned or given to somebody to run the business. What we understand is some individuals may have gone overseas and said, you have this building for 500,000 rand. We don't care how much of revenue you get out of it, as long as you give us the 500,000 rand. So guess what? I go and put in a couple of more shacks that I need and make my 2 million rand. Then what happened? A disaster like this happened. Where is law enforcement in this? Where is the city of Joburg that is supposed to monitor these things? People are desperate for housing. People don't want to live there. When you say, how can society react to it? Let's create affordable housing. Everybody wants to pay. And when I pay for my space, I'm going to protect my space. And I see that even in Denver, I see people are very passionate about these tinfoil structures only because they have a roof over their head. So civil society can certainly step up to educate people. But there's a growing need and it's not being serviced.
Speaking of civil society, I mean, we see organizations such as the Marshalltown Fire Justice Campaign that has come together. There's a night vigil that's taking place tomorrow, but they've sort of journeyed with the people throughout the year in ensuring that justice is served. How much of a voice has civil society organizations had, particularly in this situation, that we could take as lessons for other situations? Because we know, like you mentioned, many other buildings are burning around not just Johannesburg, but in other cities across the country.
What I can tell you is that civil society and organizations like probono.org, for instance, Norton Rose Fulbright, did the whole case pro bono. They saw to it that the victims would be represented at the commission. And Justice Sisi Kempepe told me, Andy, if we did not have those victims being represented, we wouldn't have heard the true stories. It's a great impact. When we look at organizations like Ashraful Aid, coming on board and bringing food parcels, and then I'm saying, but people don't have things to cook on. They then bring hot meals, bring mattresses, gift of the givers. You know, those are organizations that have stepped up. When I look at the city, I ask myself, where is the city? Where is our taxpayers' money? What is happening with this thing? You know, we look at civil society organizations, we look at NGOs stepping up with the limited resources that you have and achieving a lot, only because of the four-letter word, will. We want to get it done, we will get it done.
But what do you think differentiates between the officials that sit there with the resources, the organizations that don't have the resources but have the will? Where do we lose the will when the resource is there?
You don't take it personally. If you don't take something personally and it's an 8-to-4 job for you, and then you come to a disaster site before Christmas, and you don't know how those, you can't feel that these individuals don't have a home, they won't have food over Christmas, but you're already planning your holiday, then you don't have a personal interest in it. NGOs, on the other hand, it's a passion, and we know we have to do it because we want to create a better world. Yeah. It's not just a job, 8-to-4 job, you know. Even with trauma counseling, you know, I have to kind of take myself into the situation and say, okay, I am the mother and I have lost the child. How am I feeling? I have 3 kids here and they are starving. What am I going to do? I'm going to hustle to get the food. And that's how we think. So we phone everybody. I phone, you know, Advocate Shafi from probono.org, for instance. I'll say, can you arrange some food parcels? And he'll get on the phone and he'll phone an organization and we get the food parcels going. Government officials, 8 o'clock, in the office, paperwork, 4 o'clock, gone home. And that's it. You'll never get hold of them after hours. You know, it's a tragedy. It's really a tragedy because it's a waste of resources. I know how much of resources the city has. The city can respond to it if they have the will to do it.
And surely it's not all government officials that are working on such projects.
It's very unfair to say government officials as a coverage. They are very good, dedicated government officials, but the bureaucracy that they face as well. You know, you often get called aside, oh, Andy, come speak to me away from the cameras. I want to tell you something. You know, I'm being pushed. I can't do this because so-and-so has told me, no, I must hold on. You know, the funds need to go somewhere else. They also get frustrated. I know of a very senior official who said to me in November, I'm not going to do this job anymore. I'm leaving. I'm leaving at the end of December. A critical person who was involved with the fire from the beginning, an official.
Sure, Andy, a very sad state of affairs, but hopefully with all the lessons that we can take and learn from this situation, we'll be able to do better as a city and most certainly as a country, because we cannot have such situations. Like you say, it's the worst disaster in a fire for something that's happened in Africa, and we're treating it as a by the way. But thank you for your efforts and other civil society organizations that have come to the fore for those that have survived this and also those that have lost their loved ones. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for the time.